Australian True Crime is a proudly independent podcast produced by us, with no corporate or network overlords policing our content. Unfortunately, that means we get none of their cash either. If ongoing payments aren't for you, you can now make a one-off contribution of any amount you wish simply by clicking the link in the show notes. You'll know which one. Hello, Australian True Crime listeners. I'd love to tell you that I'm constantly running out of food at home because I'm a busy working mum with no time to shop. But I think it's actually because I'm just really bad at admin. And it doesn't even really matter why it is. All that matters is that I do have to feed these children and pets, and I need milk for my coffee. Luckily, I found DoorDash, and they bring you snacks and drinks and household essentials, like to your house, in under 45 minutes. So I don't have to stop editing podcasts or drive to the shops or even put on pants. They bring cleaning supplies, pet food, even everything I need from the reject shop. And right now, our listeners, that's you, can get $10 off and zero delivery fees on their first order of $20 or more when you download the DoorDash app and enter the code OzTrueCrime. That's AUZ, by the way, OzTrueCrime, all one word. $10 off and zero delivery fees on your first order when you download the DoorDash app in the App Store and enter the code OzTrueCrime. One more time. AUZ, True Crime, for $10 off your first order with DoorDash. God bless those people. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to Aboriginal elders emerging. The following podcast contains accounts of sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised.
I don't think I've ever met any victim that meets and fits that criteria for the perfect passive victim. But to be not viewed in a negative way in a courtroom, you have to actually play that role, and how deeply damaging that is for us as individuals.
Regular listeners to Australian True Crime will know that we've featured the work of journalist Nina Funnell several times this year and the Let Her Speak and Let Us Speak campaigns. Nina's brought a number of issues to our attention. We started on a high note with the repeal of laws in Tasmania and the Northern Territory that had prevented victims of sexual assault from telling their own stories under their own names. Tasmanian Janelle O'Connor joined us to tell her story for the first time. And here we are, how many years later?
26.
And you're allowed to tell us your story.
Yeah.
With your own name attached and your own face attached.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
Relieved and extremely empowered by the Let Her Speak campaign.
Unfortunately, in August, Nina and fellow journalist Sherelle Moody discovered that Victoria had passed problematic legislation earlier in 2020.
So on February 7 this year, very quietly when no one was really paying much attention, partly because of bushfires and then COVID, the laws in Victoria did change, and they've changed in such a way that it's now a crime for sexual assault survivors to speak to the media under their real name in cases where there is a conviction in place against the offender, and also in cases where the matter is still before the courts. So for sexual assault survivors who are in that position, including those who might have gotten a conviction against their offender 5 years ago, 20 years ago, at any point in time, they are now all prohibited from being identified in the media. And the only way around this is if they go back to court and they get a court order that says they're allowed to be identified. And that includes, a whole lot of clergy abuse victims, those who have come out of Ballarat, some of whom have been doing public advocacy work for decades and who are now all of a sudden being told, hold on, you're not allowed to be named, you'll have to go back to court if you want to continue to do that advocacy work.
We heard from one survivor who had been breaking the law on a daily basis for months without knowing it. We couldn't name her at the time, but it was, of course, Darcy Erlich, who has since won a court order enabling her to speak publicly again. Here's what she had to say at the time.
Yeah, just another, hurdle in this long journey. Like we haven't had enough. We just thought throw another one at us. Okay, so Dan Andrews called us last night, and so that was very reassuring. We felt that this was a stuff up. Jill Hennessy did call us this morning as well and reassure us that the laws will be changed, not quick enough for us because September 21st is our big decision and we can't actually speak about that on September 21st. So we have begun the process of applying to lift that gag so that will happen before these laws are changed. But the fact that we even have to do that it's just excruciating. And the fact that this was something that was put into place for survivors to have to overcome this hurdle, even if it was a mistake. I had so many survivors call me yesterday and just say the fact that this has been done, that it wasn't carefully considered of exactly how this was going to affect people that have so little choice already. I mean, that should have never have happened. I did a couple of articles yesterday, and the fact that, I read the articles and I'm anonymous, I felt like crying. I mean, I felt like I had been told that the law was telling me that there was something to be ashamed about what we were doing. And I know that that was not the intention, but that was how it felt.
Unbelievably, in their attempt to rectify their mistake, the Victorian Government came up with another disastrous proposed law in October.
But what's happening now is they're going to introduce new legislation. They're debating it in Parliament this week. And what that new legislation will do is effectively it will return agency, generally speaking, to adult sexual assault survivors to be able to decide if and when they tell their story. But what they're tacking on to the end of it, which has caught everybody off guard, is some additional legislation. And what that additional legislation will do is criminalise anyone from naming a deceased sexual assault victim. So think people like Jill Maher or Eurydice Dixon or Aya Masawa or any number of individuals who have taken their own lives post-sexual assault, particularly in cases of sexual abuse and clergy. And those families, along with families of people like Jill Maher and Aya Masawa and so on, if they want to continue to speak out about their deceased loved one, they will now need to go back to court and fight for a court order to do that and actually prove that their case is in the public interest. So they're going to have to pass a threshold test, and that is a public interest test. They'll also need to demonstrate what the victim's wishes were, if known, if it was known whether that victim wanted to be identified in public prior to their death. So it's pretty extraordinary that they would do this, and they haven't actually consulted with those grieving families before adding this on. So I'm dumbfounded, to be honest, that they could screw up so substantially the first time round in implementing a gag on living sexual assault survivors, and now they're going to fix the gag on living sexual assault survivors but replace it with a different gag, which is on the families of deceased sexual assault victims.
So if, for example, Tom Maher wanted to talk about sentencing issues in relation to Adrian Bailey being out on parole when he attacked Jill Maher, Tom's wife, he would not be able to name Jill in talking about that because he wouldn't have had her express permission before her death to do that, because she obviously had no way of knowing that she would ever be a victim of sexual assault and be murdered.
That's correct, but he also wouldn't be able to name himself either, because if he were to name himself as the husband of a now deceased sexual assault victim, he would indirectly be identifying her, so he could face 4 months jail or fines of thousands of dollars were he to identify himself. And I think it's important to clarify that this doesn't only apply to publications and media moving forward. Any news article which is still accessible online, which names Jill Maher or Eurydice and others, would need to be pulled down. And it also applies to social media, and they've explicitly written that into the legislation. So that means that the social media accounts of relatives and family members who have talked about their loved ones, or things like memorial pages, Wikipedia pages, if there have been GoFundMe set up to help grieving families with funeral costs, all of that will be in breach of the law and need to come down, or the people responsible for writing that material or producing and publishing that content could face up to 4 months jail or fines.
That legislation appears to have been abandoned, but you can bet Nina Funnell will be keeping an eye on proposed amendments moving forward. Over the Christmas period, we'll be bringing you the work of other creators of true crime podcasts. There are some very good shows that we're excited to bring to your attention, including our very own Emily Webb's new podcast, Crime Fiction Fridays, in which she talks to crime fiction authors and previews their latest books. Hopefully you'll have time to take a break after this bizarre year, read some books and discover some new podcasts. We'll be back with all new Australian true crime episodes in 2021, but it seemed fitting to close out the year with our friend Nina Funnell and another amazing woman whose story Nina brought to us after they fought together to gain a court order so it could be told. It's another example of how important it is for survivors of sexual abuse to be able to tell their stories, because this is a story about the added barriers experienced by people who face intersectionality. That is to say, their social and political disadvantages combine to create increased discrimination in the legal system. Today's guest is Nicole Lee, who is a disability advocate. Nicole uses a wheelchair and she's also a family violence and rape survivor. In this episode, with the help of Nina Funnell, she'll talk about aspects of the sexual assault she was subjected to by her carer, who was also her husband, that she's never spoken about before. I should let you know as well that if you feel as though there's a cat in the room with you, it's probably Nicole's. Even the concept of intersectionality has always been controversial to people who aren't in it, I reckon, you know?
Yeah, you see, if it's not something that you've lived with or you've been sort of surrounded with your, your friends or the bubble or whatever you live in, then yeah, I guess it's kind of all new information, and that information can be a bit, sometimes scary or feel a bit threatening sometimes.
Yeah, I think it can feel a bit threatening. The idea that things can be compounded, that issues can kind of stack up on top of each other so that a person can be more vulnerable. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I tend to sort of steer clear of the language around vulnerability, but more sort of, especially with that sort of intersectionality lens, it's sort of like thinking of it as if it's layering. So you start off with, with gender, and then you start bringing in disability, culturally, linguistically diverse people, First Nations, gender identity, sexuality, and you start, and the more things that you sort of that intersect with you and who you are, those barriers start to then increase, and there's more of them that you have to navigate.
Barriers is a better word, yeah.
Yeah, barriers is a better word. I think I've written a piece recently around sort of that language of vulnerability, and it sort of shifts the focus on where the responsibility sits for violence and neglect and abuse. And if you're posing the person as vulnerable, it's kind of almost as if it's expected. And you're kind of missing the role of the one who chose to, take advantage of somebody or abuse their position of power over someone. And it just it shifts, and it's almost in that kind of victim blaming sort of, whilst it's not meant that way, it starts to then lead down that way. Does that make sense? I guess. Sorry, I'm not explaining it very well.
Yeah, it does. No, you are, because the exact situation I was thinking of when I used the word vulnerable was actually about you being continually put back in the care of your abuser by, like, say, for example, the legal system, So yeah. I was actually thinking about, yes, that system making you vulnerable. I wasn't thinking about it being your responsibility.
Yes, yeah, exactly. The systems put people in vulnerable situations, and they make, and they create these vulnerable environments, that they expect us to exist in and live in and keep putting us back in. But, that vulnerability doesn't sit with the person because we don't control the system.
But the way you talk about it is like a better way of looking at it. It's like that creates a barrier to your safety.
Yeah. And I like to sort of then, sort of pose it, especially in the context of care, is they're vulnerable to abusing their position of power.
Yeah.
And the system is kind of almost sort of as if, and then the system is then has so many failings and flaws, and it's sort of, by putting people back into those positions, it's highlighting just how vulnerable the system is to failing.
Yeah.
So it kind of just shifts that language that, so you could say disability policy, creates vulnerable situations or puts people in vulnerable positions rather than, because it tends to get then used on, sort of centered on the person rather than all the things that actually, are out of that person's control and that we don't have a choice in half the time. And you do, you do exist in these relationships because you've got no other choice. You need to live, and if that's your only, the abuser, the person that's abusing you is your only. It's the only thing that's keeping you alive on a day-to-day basis. You don't really have much choice, especially if options aren't being made available to you.
It's one of those things people often ask me, why are you interested in true crime? One of my great interests is systemic failure. So often when we sort of backtrack through a crime, a criminal event, what we find is some kind of systemic failure. Someone's been let down. One or multiple people have been let down by one or multiple systems in our culture. The education system, the healthcare system, the foster system, family court system. And so what you're talking about there is exactly the kind of thing that I always like to highlight, that a large portion of the community won't know about, but it's really crucial to all of us.
And when you start looking at the criminal justice system and you start looking at the role that courts play in violent offences, and if the person, and then how disability then gets placed in all of those situations, and how it either positively or negatively affects how you're viewed or how you're taken seriously, and what all the outcomes are. Like half of the time, we're not seen as credible witnesses when it comes to courtrooms. So people with disability. We're not believed, even if you go to the police half the time. They're all barriers. I know one of the things I was disclosing to people, and nobody was taking any action, and so then you start distrusting all of the systems. And then the more that I know now, post all of that, victims' testimonies and things that are thrown out based on that understanding of disabled people not being competent.
And the misunderstanding of what a disability means. So if a person can't speak for themselves, what does that mean about their cognitive ability? And what does it mean about their believability? And so many victims are disbelieved because they can't actually speak for themselves.
Yeah, and the courts have a very, very simplistic sort of view and understanding of all that sort of, that cognitive ability and their understanding versus like our understanding of it, which is, much more complex, and they have a very different sort of view and opinion on that, and then how that plays out in courtrooms and in these cases and stuff. And like my own, it's, it's either used to almost shift the blame from what he did into, it's that kind of language of care or burnout, and that it was such a hard job to look after a disabled person, but then, sort of positioned in, that you shouldn't do that to a disabled person. And because he had a disability as well, then it had this kind of like double whammy. Well, or how are you coping in jail as a disabled man? And, and how is this going to affect you and your disability? And it just morphed and moved all over the place, and it certainly didn't get sort of all overly reflected into my direction in the way that it should have.
So when you said earlier in our conversation that you're with this person because you rely on them to keep you alive, at one point were you with this person because you loved him? What was the beginning of your relationship?
Yeah, so the beginning of our relationship, we met through disability sports, and it was the start. So I guess like for the first year, and these are the things that I can sort of pinpoint now. But when we met, the relationship moved very quickly, and it did move from that, just purely dating to within a few weeks he'd moved into my home, and then a couple of months later we decided that we'd get pregnant and have a baby. So it was that very fast, rapid moving, living out of each other's pockets sort of whirlwind romance. And, and then about a year after, my youngest was born at the end of knowing each other for 12 months. So it was very, very quick, incredibly quick. And then unfortunately, the offending started not long after he was born.
So again, that's not long after you got together, really. We're still talking a pretty short window.
Yeah, so that was, about a year later, after we'd been together for a bit over a year, that, the sexual offending started.
So without any disability involved, this is a pretty classic case in a lot of ways, isn't it? Does it look that way from your perspective? Were there those other sort of telltale signs of controlling in other ways and of separating you, sort of isolating you from friends and family and all those sorts of things?
Yeah, no, there was, absolutely. So things like, when he moved in, this is quite a long time ago, and I didn't even own a computer back then. I didn't have home internet or anything like that. So when he moved in, he had a computer. He was quite, reasonably savvy with all that sort of stuff. And I used to go down to the post office to pay my bills. So he moved in, bought in a computer, got some internet connected to the house, and started to take over control of paying all of the bills. So, doing them online, doing it via BPay. And so I'd slowly gotten, cut off from that form of independence of, being quite capable of managing my own budget and paying my own bills and bits and pieces, to it all moved to this online world. So throughout, the time that I was with him for the 10 years, I really didn't touch the computer. I still didn't know how to use one. He took control of all of that and net banking and everything. So, by 10 years later, and, we're talking 2014, and the world had shifted quite a bit, I had no idea how to do any of that stuff. So I was reliant on him for to navigate all of that, and everything had been taken online. And I'm the person that used to go down to the post office, and now all of a sudden I didn't think that I was capable of doing that. And it was always positioned in the context of I wasn't very smart, and I wasn't clever enough to understand this technology. So I need to do it for you. And then that just moved into a whole heap of slurs around, my intellectual capacity, and some really toxic language saying that you're stupid. That within the disability community is a really horrible slur. So that shifted into my name over the years, and the relationship became Stupid Woman. It's a slow progression to all of those things. So you don't just, it's not like, everything was great and then all of a sudden one day it just all of us boomed out of nowhere. It just slowly creeps in and just gets a little bit worse and a little bit worse until all of a sudden, by the end of that 10 years and he'd been removed and all of these stuff had happened and gone through courts. And I reflect back now and I just wonder, at what point did he go from we were in this relationship and this whirlwind romance to hating me, like absolutely viciously hating me when I look back over it all. And I don't know when that shifted because it's so gradual.
Yeah, well, I guess his personality probably didn't, don't you think? I mean, I guess he was always that person in a weird way. Like it was always acting out the same pattern or the same narrative. It's just that your place in the cycle changed, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And, in the conversations I have with other survivors now, sort of on the other side of this, in this advocacy space and chatting with other survivors and the things that they do, it is like a playbook. And it's almost as like, is there a book that they're reading? Because they all do such similar things. And I think, and university's given me that language to kind of pin to this is around, Wright Mills and private trouble, public issue. Is that how can so many people do such intimate, isolated things and all do it the same way? And that's where you start looking to, okay, what is the societal context that all of these men exist within? And that's the stuff I find really fascinating because how else can they all do just the same things? It's mind-boggling.
I know, it is, isn't it? It's reminding me of that documentary on Netflix at the moment. Have you watched it, American Murder? I don't know, it might be too triggering. But
no.
Yeah.
I haven't watched that one
right.
yet.
Well, Chris Watts was an American, husband, father, seemed to the neighbours and the friends and everybody like he was a perfect guy, but very similar kind of stuff out of the playbook.
Yep.
Went through these cycles with his wife, and the first one happened literally the week after they got married.
Gee.
Where he just suddenly started ignoring her and because he had a bee in his bonnet about something. And
it's and I honestly want to think and I think this is just my way of coping with it, that I honestly want to be able to believe that it's not a conscious choice. But I think that's a little naive of me, but it's sort of to think that somebody deliberately employed these tactics is kind of hard to bear some days.
So how did you begin your journey, for want of a better word, out of this relationship?
Well, for me, it's not that sort of, well, I guess I did begin that journey, and it's not as the traditional sort of idea that you think of, that one day, somebody just sort of had enough, or they got up one day and decided that's it, I'm done, I'm leaving. I had gotten so broken down in that relationship and over that 10 years that I didn't think that there was any way out of it. So it escalated and boiled to the point where, I took an overdose, and my oldest son found me on the floor and called an ambulance to come and get me because his stepfather wouldn't get up and get out of bed. And, so in that emergency department, after the ambulance came and he still refused to speak to the ambulance officers, the emergency department afterwards, asked me, why had I done that? And I said, well, because my husband's raped me 4 times this week. I don't want to live anymore. And they're quite shocked by that. And but their response was, well, would you like to go to a refuge? And knowing that my children were here, my mental health is an absolute mess. I'm a disabled woman, and I'm thinking I can't go to a refuge. I'll probably never see my children again, and I can't leave them in that home. So they called him to come and pick me up, and they sent me back home to him. It was somewhere in that emergency department somebody called Child Protection. Somebody alerted them, and that's where, for us here, everything changed. And I can tell you right now, the thought of Child Protection coming around when I realised that that was happening and there was nothing I could do about it was absolutely terrifying. But speaking with them when they first came to the house and they put us in the room together, and they just upfront and bluntly said to him, so Nicole presented the emergency department saying that you raped her 4 times this week. What have you got to say to that? And he's like, yeah, so what? I did that. All men do this.
Oh, my God. Did he?
And I was shocked. He did, yes. He just owned up and confessed to it as if, like, well, so what? We all do this. Men have got needs. And being just shocked that he was so upfront and honest about it, and thinking to myself, I know this is a crime. I'd been telling him over the years that it was a crime. And just thinking, oh, my God, there's nothing I can do. I can't stop what's going to happen. And it just sort of all progressed from there. The police became involved eventually and put an intervention order on him and removed him from the house.
But at what point, even on that night, did you realise that you weren't going to lose the kids? Because he must have had you – I know that from what you've already said, that he had you feeling so low that you must have felt almost guilty yourself.
That took a while because they didn't remove him that day. They went and they did their investigation. It was probably about a month later that police stepped in and removed him. So in this time, I'm still here existing with this, and things are really escalating by this point. When I think back to it, it was actually rather freaking dangerous. When I think back that nobody took any action there and then, and I think I'm incredibly lucky. But, and eventually, the police did intervene, and he was called into the police station and questioned, and an intervention order was put on him. And this is the thing, not some of us, and I usually, for some of us, we've lost our independent decision-making capacity. And in that 10 years, I lost my agency as a woman to be able to make choices for myself. So even in this moment, and in a police station, and I'm still thinking, what do I need to do that's going to keep this man calm? And all of my decisions, and I can look back now and I can see every single decision I made was one that I thought he'd want me to make, and one I thought was going to keep us safe. So when the police stepped in and just said, well, you actually can't keep yourself safe right now. We're really, really worried, and we need to do this because this man will offend again. He's even said he will offend again, and we can't let him back into that home. And I'm begging them not to do this. And people, look at, well, we shouldn't take agency away from women. But you know what? I pose it in this position. They didn't actually take the choice to leave away from me. They took it away from him, and they took my agency away from him. And, sort of threw me and it back home with the children. But then services then started to intervene. Services then started to come into the house and work with myself and the kids so that I could start to refine my agency again and be able to make decisions and be able to protect myself again. And I honestly I don't think I would have ever been able to leave if they didn't do that. I probably would have died if the police hadn't have stepped in.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you needed to be given the confidence to believe that you could take care of yourself, right? Because he'd convinced you that you didn't know how to function in the world.
I just honestly didn't know how to function in the world, and over that 10 years, the other thing that happened is that I developed anorexia quite severely, especially towards the end, and I was incredibly unwell, and I relied on him for getting the kids to school, and I'd become also, emotionally, he was there for my mental health and my physical health as well. So I needed somebody to also help me remain on my own in the home. I couldn't do it on my own with the children at that point. I didn't have much in the way of support or workers coming in because it wasn't I wasn't allowed to. So one of the big shifting turning points for me after they removed him, and for 8 weeks I didn't know what to do because they removed my carer, and at that point nobody asked, actually, what are your physical needs right now? What do we need to do? What do we need to put in place? Nobody asked that. So the kids and I were thrown at the home on our own. And for that, for 8 weeks, we struggled. We really, really struggled. I couldn't get my back door open and feed my dogs. I couldn't get the kids to school. I couldn't, get the vacuum cleaner around the house. I'm a woman in a wheelchair. I couldn't have a shower was the other thing. I couldn't shower on my own because I wasn't, at that point in a state to be able to do that. And it was eventually I went to my child protection worker and just said to her, I'm going to have to go into that courtroom and have that intervention order lifted because we are not surviving and I don't know what else to do and I don't have anybody else.
And that would have been everything he's been saying, right?
Yeah. I'd been isolated from my mum and dad, so they weren't really able to, and I wasn't in a position to have that relationship with them. And I didn't have any friends or anything that I could call on because I'd been distanced from all of those. Being able to ask somebody for a favour wasn't anything that, I didn't have that available to me. So it was literally just myself and two children, 16 and 9, and no services in place. So it wasn't until I sort of said to Child Protection, I need help, that they went to I think they went upstairs, actually. They had disability services in their building at DHHS, Department of Health and Human Services, and they went up there and just said, we've got this woman and we don't know what to do. Have you got any ideas? And that's when they said, we've got this brokerage funding. What does she need? We'll get a support worker in there today. So it was that bringing in support workers into the home where I was actually able to realise that, okay, well, if I'm supported to be here on my own, I can actually do this. And there are the resources available for me to actually have workers come in, and I don't need to rely on this man who's abusing me anymore for my, the day-to-day kind of care needs. And that's sort of, the missing part for disabled people is we can't just get up and leave. We actually need access to someone to help us get up and leave. So that's something that I've said in different places and forums, is that you can make all the refuges accessible as you want, but if they don't have access to support workers, then how are they getting to the refuge and how are they staying in there? And that was sort of how I was in my home was, well, okay, you've removed him and we're physically safe, but how am I actually going to stay here independently without support? And that's when things shifted for me, and I was able to see the difference between need and want. So I needed him to survive, but I didn't want him. And that was a massive shift in my thinking.
Yeah, it's not just about ramps.
Yeah, it's more than just a ramp. Yes, exactly.
Well, I was going to ask you actually if you think that, again, intersectionality plays a part in this, because I feel like abusers are constantly trying to convince their partners that you'll never survive without me. You will never survive without me. And so in your situation, there is this extra element of you literally can't shower without me, mate. You can't open the back door without me.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So it's literally, and I try to say to people that, for women with disabilities, I wasn't just emotionally, made reliant on that, you'll never survive without me. I actually physically couldn't survive without somebody coming into the house and helping me. But that's that thing. So you get cut off from all those support networks, which then creates that barrier for somebody with a disability to be able to leave. And then, so you're disconnected from the information around, what you're entitled to or what your rights are with support needs or care needs. So, like, you only know what you know. And if you haven't been allowed to know what you're allowed to ask for from the system or, like with the NDIS, then you don't even know that you can access supports to not have to rely on this person. So it's just this combination of they create the barriers and then you get denied knowing what your rights are as well. And we're expecting people that have been denied knowledge of their rights and have been completely and utterly broken down and disempowered to all of a sudden get up one day and make an entirely empowered decision and leave. And we wonder why we can't do it. And that's where the system fails.
So what happens next? You get your support systems in place. You start to think, actually, maybe I can do this, and you start to get some confidence back. Meanwhile, what's happening legally with your partner, with your husband?
Yeah, so during all of this time, I held off for quite a long time making a statement against him. All of those fears of the system, unfortunately, I have intersected with the system in the past. Just as somebody with a mental health condition, police were always called as a sort of almost like a punishment. I was then taken off to hospital and put on involuntary treatment orders, so a little standoffish. I understood just how hard that was going to be, and I held off for a very, very long time. And I remember saying to the police and making a deal with them, I said, okay, well, maybe if you're all telling him that this is a crime, maybe then he will go and get help, and I'll give him this one last chance. And I did that, and because that's what we do. We give them chances. And it was the day he called me to say that he told them to stick their men's behaviour change program, breaching the intervention order whilst doing this as well. He'd stick their program and I could stick it and we could all go and jump, and some lovely language in there. So, okay, all right, he's refusing to get help, and I stuck to my deal with the police, and I called my contact person and just said that I need to come in and make the statement. And she got me in that afternoon, which was very, very smart of her.
Yeah, I know, because we go back on it, don't we?
Yes, I would have.
We go, give us a few days, and we go, oh, God, maybe he'll get help.
That cycle would have started, so he's had this outburst, and if she had have waited even to the next day, he would have gotten in with an apology, and I would have gone, okay, cool, I'll give you one more chance. Mm-hmm. But she didn't. She got me that afternoon, and I made the statement, and I stuck to it, and I never took it back.
Well, even now, earlier in this conversation when you were saying, I just don't know when he started hating me. Even that's very emotional language.
Mm.
You're still sort of talking about him hating you. It feels like you'd still rather he stopped hating you. Can he get help so that he doesn't hate me? It's painful. It's so painful to think that somebody hates you.
Yeah, of course it is. And it's
because you don't deserve it. How could that happen? Well,
Yeah. What did I do that warranted just this absolute hatred? We've got a child together. We've gotten married. We're building a life together. I'm thinking that we're going to live together until we're old and on the back porch, slurping a peach. And
yeah, right.
You could not do this to somebody that you loved. You just couldn't. And I just have to I have to hold on to that.
Yeah, I don't think there's a woman alive, honestly, if we're honest with ourselves, who doesn't understand that feeling of I'd rather he snap out of it and go back to the guy I met and make me feel not so worthless and hateable than have to go through the whole court process. Yeah. I don't want revenge. I just don't want to feel like shit.
Yep.
Yeah.
But as that time goes on, and that all starts to shift, and there's just all this frustration and all the questions around why. But I know it took a while for me for all of that stuff to start land and sink in. And one of the things I guess, and something that came to me through university, and I think there's a fair amount of sort of research and stuff there, and I'd love to see some research done on this actually, is around women's response to stress, and our fight and flight response is that we actually release oxytocin, which makes us tend and befriend. So if you look at a violent relationship, and this is what is, I guess, one of my aha moments, which is that part where I could never quite put my finger on why it was I thought that I loved him, or why I thought I had this emotion there that didn't make sense, considering I still I hated him while I was with him, and I wanted it all to stop, and I wanted him gone, but what was this weird attachment that I can't name? And I honestly think that there is a fair level amount of chemical bonding.
Fascinating.
That, tend and befriend, if you've been isolated from everyone, you've got nobody around you, you've got nobody to sort of go to for help. So befriending is that you tend to your children and you align yourself with the people around you to help you keep yourself and your children safe, and that's just an evolutionary thing that apparently women do. And it just made sense to me because I'm keeping the kids safe from this violent, angry person, and he's doing all these things to me. So he's enacted that response in myself. But then that nice part of them comes out a few days later, the apologies. So that cycle of abuse, explode and then apologise and they're sorry. So I was befriending that nice guy that came out in a few days' time, and then I'm constantly trying to do everything to keep that nice guy there. And so and to stop, to keep us safe. And that was that attachment I just couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't until there was absolutely zero contact for a good couple of weeks that there was no subliminal messages via social media or from other people. There was just nothing. And I was able to start to see things more clearly, and it was like this fog just started to lift, and I realised all those subliminal messages he's leaving, all of these things that he's doing, I'm looking and seeing, does he love me or hate me today? And I realised how much control he had over my emotions, whether I had a good day or a bad day, pinned on what he left in his good grace for me to see. And that's when I started to have that clarity, but I needed that space of no contact from him completely for all of that to dissipate, because every time I'd have contact, it would enact that fear response. And so, again, you're stuck in that cycle.
Yeah, which is why we know now that that's such a dangerous time for women, right? Because abusers realise that fog is lifting, that control is waning, and they panic.
Yes.
And that becomes a really dangerous time for women.
Yeah, well, the thing is that they don't actually tell you this, and I didn't know, the danger that I was in, and he's written a letter around the intervention order to drop the kids off and pick them up and all that sort of stuff, and and all this time, by this stage he's been charged and he's out on bail, and things are escalating, and I'm feeling really unsafe, but not realising why, and eventually going to the police and saying, actually, he's breaching the intervention order. And I think I was very lucky that he got remanded into custody at that point, because he was realising that, because I'd started to, somebody had showed me how to pay bills, how to use net banking, and I'd started to take control of all of my finances. And he was losing that control over me. And he was losing that visibility over my life and the children's lives, and things were starting to escalate. And I think I'm lucky, and I'm really grateful that ended up happening. But, geez, I wish somebody had told me.
Yeah, I feel like we didn't know. Is that true? I mean, obviously,
I didn't know.
I feel like as a society we kind of only are just putting this together. Is that true? I guess you've done a lot more research.
I think so. Yeah. No, well, look, we have known over the history, and the people that I've met along this way, is that, women are murdered in the context of separation, and it is something that is documented throughout history. It's just not really something that's overly, I guess, it's now more broadly discussed within, conversations and within the community.
Right.
It's got more visibility than it ever had before. I guess it didn't have that visibility back then. But then I guess, services are trying to then weigh up, if we tell women, are they scared? Will that make them too scared to leave? But I sort of position it in, well, if you don't tell them, they don't have the tools necessary. Information is power. Okay, well, if I need to leave, and that's going to put me in danger, then I need to engage services to make sure I'm safe. And you're putting, you're giving them the best possible chance to make the right choices, to reach out to services and demand that help from them. Because, again, you only know what you know, and I didn't realise, I wouldn't have put myself in a position of allowing him to pull into the street to drop the children off or be anywhere near him. I would have chosen somewhere much more open and populated by people, rather than putting myself in a very vulnerable and dangerous position.
And you weren't even really aware at that time, were you? I'm jumping ahead, but you weren't even aware of the level of offending that he had committed against you.
Well, I guess I was. It wasn't until I had to go in and make that statement that it all started to kind of hit and really sink in. And I think I even had to go and make an amendment to my statement, because So it was, one of the moments, because it's little bits and pieces that, trigger memories and things. And I passed out on the kitchen floor and came to and realised, oh God, that's what happened. And then had to go on, amend my statement. But you can't take the gravity of it on board at the time, and the severity of it and the full impact of it. And I think that really comes down to being something that keeps you, a survival mechanism, in that if I could have taken it on board while I was living with it or just after getting out, I think mentally I probably wouldn't have coped.
Yeah, I'd be scared to go and amend my statement, though. As you're saying that, I'd think, are they going to think I'm lying or making it up if I come back and go, I forgot a bit? Like, were they cool about that when you came back and said
No, she was really good.
Okay.
She was really good. And even now, sort of looking back retrospectively, there's so many things that he didn't get charged with. There's such a huge amount more that he didn't get charged with, and it's really confronting when you have to sit down and you've got to put a date to everything.
A date.
So a date, a point in time in the year, and you're talking 10 years of this, and so the only ones that I could pinpoint were things like, if it was around the time of somebody's birthday, or we'd been to a wedding, or, if what was going on at that time. It's like, oh, yeah, we'd gone to so-and-so's birthday and they were turning this age and they're this old now. So that would have been in this month of this year. Even going back through, on Instagram, and I'd put up photos on there, and I know I put up that photo after that had happened, and just working your way back. And when there's that many that you actually can't put a date to, that's still something I don't think I can fully, even myself can fully, digest it.
No, I can't imagine if there were 4 sexual assaults in a week.
Yeah.
I don't know where you start.
No, you just, it's a difficult one, and it hits me every now and then. The gravity of it, and I think, more recently with the gag laws and everything, has really sort of brought it all back up for me again, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think I do a fair bit of, sort of burying it back down again, and that's not really processing it or working through it. That's just ignoring that it's there half the time.
Yeah, I can understand wanting to do that, though, or sort of I can understand the temptation, I guess, to think, oh, God, haven't I done enough processing? Can I just kind of bury it for a while again and get on with a nice new life?
Yeah, some days I just like, I wish I could just forget it. I wish, that I could just forget that all this happened and forget that was my life, and I can move on and just have somebody else's life. But it's not possible, unfortunately. And some days I don't even want to hear the words, especially the word rape. Some days I absolutely just utterly hate that word, and I don't want to hear anybody use it. I don't want to see it written. Yeah, it's difficult.
What about when you finally got to court? I mean, had you reconciled with your family or anything like that? Did you have a support network together when it came to court?
No, we didn't by that stage. No, the relationship with my mum was very fragmented at that point. Like it's fine now, it's beautiful now, and that's one of the things that I really hate him for. It is he took away my relationship with my mother. He impacted my ability to mother my children and protect my children as well. And that's a huge loss that I grieve over. But by the time we got to, and it all happened really quickly. So within 6 months of him being charged, it was his sentencing hearing. So he tried to do a plea deal, and they wouldn't allow him to plea any of the charges down. It was all of the charges, or it was a trial. So he pled guilty to everything. I remember they gave me cab charges, so I had witness assistance sort of services through the county court that were offering me support, and so I had, a court somebody from the court there sitting with me. Yeah, I went in there in a taxi on my own, and I came in home on a taxi on my own. But his sentencing went over two hearings. So they adjourned it for 6 weeks while the judge went and had to go and look and see for other similar cases, because apparently sentencing was setting a precedence for future cases. So they were going and reviewing anything that was even that was similar to this. So we had that 6 weeks adjournment in between him pleading and then him being sentenced. So I had to go back to the courtroom a second time.
It's hard for me to believe that, given that, what are the statistics of women with disability who have been sexually assaulted? They're huge, right?
They're huge. 70% of women with disabilities, 70% of women with disabilities will be sexually assaulted. And for women with intellectual disabilities, that's up to like 90%.
Right. So it's so hard for me to believe that your case so recently was setting a precedent in the court.
It just sort of, I don't know whether it was because he also had a disability or because we were married. I'm not really sure, but it's just, it's really quite confronting, and that really sort of speaks to the fact that, a lot of sexual assault cases don't actually make it to those points, and is this because women with disabilities, our statements, and we're not believed, or our as witnesses we're not seen as credible, so therefore that's a reasonable doubt in a jury to be able to find somebody guilty. Like, there's all sorts of intersecting things here that could sort of speak to that is alarming, and all the things that we need to sort of change and reform with the system, to turn that around. But you look at sexual assault cases in general, just not many of us get to even make that statement. And then once you do make that statement, how many of those make it through to charges, or then even make it through to going into a courtroom, or
right.
In my case, he pled guilty, but if they don't, then you've got to go through that committal hearing process. How many get dropped at the committal? How many make it to trial? It's so many of us don't get to that point.
You're right. So what happened? What happened at sentencing after all the deliberation, after all the research?
Well, it was hearing the judge read out that I don't remember back then exactly all the words that he said, and I'm really, really glad now that I didn't remember them, now that I've read them, however many years later, 5 years later. But, yeah.
Nicole didn't even feel comfortable hearing the judge's sentencing remarks again, so I told her I'd read them in later. Among other things, when sentencing him to raping Nicole almost daily for years on end, the judge described David Latham as a quiet, gentle and caring man. He praised him for his resilient nature, excellent work history, and for being an involved parent to his own son. By contrast, the judge referred to Nicole, David Latham's victim, as having many issues and difficulties.
Well, at the time, I remember feeling just incredibly deflated because, not only these read out the sentence for each and individual charge, but then to hear the words that this will be served concurrently. So all of the individual sentences for each charge were all to be served all at the same time. So 2 years, 6 months for all of those charges just did not feel like enough. There was, one representative count charge that represented 6 counts of rape, 3 standalone counts of rape. So that's 9 counts of rape, assault, persistent breach of an intervention order, comes down to 2 years, 6 months. And I felt cheated. I felt, And the police and the prosecutor just said to me, a result is a result.
I mean, I guess for them, they have that scenario that you were just explaining to us about how few cases get that far. So for them, they're thinking, hey, kid, we made it. We made it all the way. But to imagine that having been raped so many times and have it add up to 2 years and 6 months for a person, any other person who doesn't work in that system, is heartbreaking.
Yeah. And I just think, if I was a stranger that he had done this to, the sentence would have been far greater. I'm sure the sentence would have been far greater. The language that was used, I remember back at the time, him, the magistrate using the words love, and the fact that it was rape in marriage. It's this whole understanding that because you knew the person, it's not as bad. And that's just so wrong. At least with a stranger, I could have just hated them. But this person was somebody I'd invited into my life. I'd had a child with, I'd trusted. The breach of all of those things and the magnitude of that is massive. And sort of now that I have read the sentencing remarks 5 years on and looking at it and looking at the way he positioned the sympathy for my husband and the scorn for myself and all of those victim-blaming narratives, and then to say that he even used that your wife even admits that there was consensual sex in the relationship. So therefore, somehow was I inviting him to then also rape me as well? How did that sort of dismiss the severity of what was happening? And I think that was only used in my statement because, he'd always used the excuse of, I never get any, and that's why I do this. So I remember making an effort to have sex with him, to make him happy, to make it stop, and then he raped me that night anyway.
Of course.
And it's like, okay, well, all those excuses you kept saying to me that it was my fault that you never got any. Well, I remember just being so much more hurt by not only you doing this, but then you're also lying to me about whose fault it is as well. And to hear that in a courtroom was, and to read that was what the judge had said, is that narrative of, wifely duties hasn't shifted that far in courtrooms. It really hasn't. The fact that I was positioned as almost a provocateur, or that he cared so much about me every time I'd go to hospital without actually talking to the fact that he was the reason I was going to hospital. He was the reason I was so mentally unwell and I was struggling so much. That he was positioned as being the loving man that stood beside me, and even used the words that that he's been referred to by his his family as such a gentle, caring man. Now, I don't know any man that rapes their wife on the kitchen floor should be classed as gentle and caring.
No, and I don't know that we need his family's input so much on his demeanour at his rape trial, frankly.
No, and the fact that his defence, in obviously in some point in all of the material and everything, was able to say that that he had resentment for me, because of having to look after me, and resentment, and the fact you'd be forgiven if you thought Bettina Arndt wrote all of this, and that the difference in sex drive and how frustrated he was, and even down to and this was something within the relationship that I really regretted. I was travelling a lot with sport and wheelchair tennis, and while I was away on tour, I ended up in a situation where I froze. And I couldn't say no to this person. And so that was then classed as an affair.
Were you sexually assaulted by another person?
I wasn't sexually assaulted, but I didn't say no to him.
Okay.
So I don't think he meant anything malicious by it. And if I had have said, no, I'm not interested, I think he would have stopped. But the fact that I completely and utterly froze, because of what my husband had been doing to me for so many years.
Well, yeah.
And then that was posed as, and your wife had had an affair. I didn't get to sort of say that was not an affair. It was something that I came home and told him about, and it was horrible, and I hated myself for it. And to think that was then positioned as an affair.
I'm no psychologist, but I do know that is a classic reaction from a sexual assault victim to be afraid to say no, because in your experience, saying no just brought more violence into the sex that was going to happen anyway, right? So that makes me wonder, was there a psychologist testifying on your behalf? Was there anyone there to say, hey, woo, this is actually all part of her victimisation?
No, and that's the really... It's just the thing of, once you become a witness, the people that represent you are the ones that are doing the prosecuting. So you've got the police prosecutor, and they're literally just laying the facts on the table. That there is no objective opinion. There is no sort of putting a position from what my perspective or the responses to all of the stuff that his defence has put on the table. There was nothing there that could counteract all of that stuff that his defence had put together. And that's the thing, like, as a victim, you become so de-identified in all of this. You become this person's string of charges and things that they chose to do to you. And who you are and who you were and the impact that has no visibility in that room. And that was something I didn't expect to happen. That's not something that people tell you is what happens when you do go, into a courtroom and into these situations, and how stripping that is of you and your identity and your ability to have any humanity is at a level that it's hard to explain it to people. Whilst I don't regret going through that process, I wish I had some forewarning of what to expect.
Yeah, absolutely, because it doesn't feel like there's anyone there to kind of care for you and to help you with things that perhaps you didn't understand yet. Then that's a classic example.
Yeah. So the only thing that gave me any visibility in that courtroom was, my victim impact statement, which I know the statement I'd write now would be very, very different to what I wrote back then.
I bet.
But, I'm talking maybe this is 3 months after he's, been put into prison. This is all still very rapid. You're still starting to come to terms and to grips with everything, let alone being able to see what the impact is. Like, the impact is slow. It slowly starts to come out of the woodwork after you get into that space of being free again. So, my victim impact statement, while I look back at it and I think, oh no, it wasn't too bad. It was pretty strong. But that's the only visibility I had. That and a very short letter from the psychologist that I'd gotten to know in hospital as well.
Look, the other thing I'm very, very aware of is that you have the legacy of managing the emotional baggage that comes out of this for your son. You share a son. Yes, and I had my own son as well. So this was his stepfather, the only sort of father that he'd really had anything to do with. So I'm not just, and this is the thing, you're not just carrying yourself and rebuilding yourself. You're also carrying your children as well, and trying to hold them and piece them back together whilst you're piecing yourself back together. And I was an incredibly, incredibly broken person, and my children were so broken and damaged as well. And oh yeah, for young men, this is an ongoing thing.
Yeah, and we were a little bit of a little mess back then. And things have shifted, and it took its time, but it wasn't pretty. And we got through it together, and we did get to the other side of it. But there was lots of really dark moments where we're all very sad. They're grieving for the loss of their dad, even though they were scared of him, because this was the only dad that they knew. This was the only life that they knew. And all of a sudden that got turned upside down. So carrying them through what they were experiencing and their trauma and especially my youngest and his nightmares and their triggers, it was, whilst living and dealing and carrying your own is really hard. It's a difficult path to walk on, but it does get better. The longer you're on it and the longer you walk on it, it does actually start to get better. And the thing is with that courtroom, it does end. The court, all that stuff that happens in that courtroom, everything that happens within the court system, it does have an end date. It doesn't continue to happen indefinitely.
I know, that's a big sigh. Now, we have been talking for an hour. How are you feeling? Do you want to break? And we haven't even talked yet about the diaries.
Yeah, and I'd like to bring Nina in on, especially around the diaries and stuff, because she will probably be able to articulate it better than me, because I still find them very confronting. I still really find them very confronting. I haven't spoken about them publicly. Same as the sentencing remarks. I haven't spoken about them, and I'm sure Nina has got a few things to say on those as well.
Thank you to our patrons for helping us bring stories like Nicole's to you again through 2020. You can become a patron, of course, at patreon.com/OstTrueCrimePod. Thank you to James O'Connor, Ellie Wilkinson, Susan Bellamy, Carol Dean, Deb Curtis and James Bateson. Coming up on Australian True Crime, Nina Funnell joins us to discuss the extraordinary diary entries Nicole's husband left to be discovered, explaining his rationalisation for continually raping her. But first, Nicole explains why she wants to challenge herself for the first time to talk to you about those diary entries.
And I think, just challenging that, that violence is uncomfortable, it's not pretty, and, that our conversations should actually maybe reflect a little bit more of that uncomfortable space. And I think that's a good thing with a podcast is that if it's too much, people can tune out.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because oftentimes we have this conversation too about what details to leave in and to edit out. And, I've said that sometimes too, as long as it's okay with the family or the person that we're talking to, is that I think I'm not going to shy away from it. I mean, violence is terrible. And if this is someone's story and they want it told, then I don't think we should be too precious to hear it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I sort of wanted Nina here to help me sort of speak to, all of those diary entries. I still find them confronting and difficult, but then also to help push me into that, stepping outside of the comfort zone, which most interviews tend to, sit in. But I also believe that if we don't go to some of those uncomfortable conversations and have some of those, sit in some of those uncomfortable positions, then I guess we don't end up in a place where, people are able to really identify what the problem is, if we're not actually telling them the true picture sometimes. So I sort of phrase it in, like sitting in that uncomfortable place and then looking at it, why does this make me uncomfortable? And then how can I use that feeling of uncomfortable to motivate me to do something different in the policy I'm writing, the way I talk about it in my community or the conversations I'm having with my friends.
Last time we spoke, we didn't even mention these diary entries at all.
No, so there's a lot of background.
There was, and we'd spoken for a while and we decided, you need a break, you need a rest, and we'll come back to it. And also what you've just been talking about then brings us back to why the stories that you've been writing, Nina, are so important and why it's important for one of the many, many reasons why it's important for people to be able to tell their stories if they want to, is that policymakers need to be able to hear these stories, isn't it? This is one of the very important reasons why. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that survivors are best placed to educate the public on the lived experience of these crimes, and hearing from people like Nicole who, obviously a lot of sexual assault survivors may wish to remain anonymous, which should always be their right. But when someone like Nicole wants to use her story as a platform to educate others and to share that depth of experience as well, including some of the contradictory or elements, or the elements which don't necessarily fit with neat victim stereotypes or narratives which the public may already find easily digestible. I think that's important because it nuances the discussion, and it means that we're, as Nicole says, we're required to do the work ourselves as audience and the public and reflect on our own prejudices and biases and assumptions about violence against women. And, one of the things that I found really interesting learning from Nicole is about the ways in which she feels her own experiences really shatter that idea of the neat, perfect victim who sort of is always passive, always demure, never speaks back to violence. And I think she's got a lot to say on that.
And also, Nicole, earlier you spoke in our last conversation, you spoke about the fact that in the court scenario, you felt as though suddenly there was this sort of idea that your partner, the perpetrator of the crime, was being treated as though he was like this great guy who was under so much pressure, and that perhaps his crimes were reflected in that way, that he had perpetrated because of the pressure that he was under as a carer.
Mm. Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, if we don't sort of go to those conversations, or we don't start to look at the intersectional ways in which different backgrounds and diversities get used against us, we've got to be looking at those courtroom narratives of how we're positioning victims and how we're positioning perpetrators. And whilst we might have abolished, the defence of provocation, especially down here in Victoria, it's certainly alive and well in, sentencing remarks via, magistrates and judges and in these positions of power, and the ways that we within our society and community look to seek to excuse men's violence and how pervasive that is across all areas. And it's not just in the locker room talk in a footy club. This is happening in our courtrooms. We're not viewing judges and magistrates as being some of the most deeply patriarchal and misogynistic men in this country. Yet they are the ones who are sitting and passing judgment on violent men towards their victims. And I was painted as that that burden, the crazy woman. And sort of sitting and thinking and looking back to that and how that feels even now to be positioned as, the crazy woman in relation to her guilty husband, and how that made him resentful towards me. Now, ultimately, when you think of the law, being black and white, it shouldn't matter what I did or shouldn't matter what anybody does. A crime is a crime, no matter what the provocation is. And that's the thing, like we're not discussing those things very deeply, and if you're not that passive victim, and the thing is, I don't think I've ever met any victim that meets and fits that criteria for the perfect passive victim, but to be able to get the sympathy from the system or to be not viewed in a negative way in a courtroom, you have to actually play that role, and how deeply damaging that is for us as individuals, how deeply damaging and how dangerous that narrative is that we put out there to the community. So for a long time myself, I didn't see myself as a victim of violence because, I did speak back, I did fight back, I did push back, I defended myself. So therefore, I felt like I had some part to play. I wasn't the woman cowering in the corner. I did try and defend myself, sometimes, in very minor ways, but because I didn't fit that stereotype, that image of the passive woman that cowered, I found it hard in a lot of ways to identify myself as being a victim of violence.
Some of what you want to confront that you find hard to confront, and I think you're being really hard on yourself, because I think that the first conversation we had was extraordinary, and I don't think that you were going easy on yourself at all. but some of the stuff that you do want to confront in this conversation is the diary entries that were uncovered of your husband's, and I think in most cases it's down to a sort of he said, she said scenario where a victim can be in a situation where they're trying to explain what he's like, what he thinks, what he says, the way he seems to be thinking when he behaves in a certain way. Rarely are we in a situation where we have a perpetrator's own thoughts written by him. Where did these come from, these diary entries? Where were they found? Who found them?
So they were on a mobile phone that used to belong to me that he'd been using before he went into jail. He'd smashed his own mobile phone by, throwing that out the window of the car in one of the many arguments. So then he was using my old little old iPhone 4, and that was, sent back to me, and it hadn't been wiped. He hadn't even signed out of iTunes, so it was completely useless for me to use, to set up for my son to use. And then, sort of looking into this and going into the notes section, there's photos on there, all these apps are on there, emails were on there, but these notes were still in the notes section of this phone, and I 100% believe that he left them on there for me to find so that I would read them and know his thoughts.
Really?
Yes, yeah. And I haven't shared them with anybody for all of these years that I've had them. I've had them for a number of years now, and it was confronting to read, and it was, it sort of took me right back to that place that I was before he went into prison, and that really the thoughts, that he had towards me, all of those apologies, all of those I'm sorries, but then this is also your fault, your mental health. You were always really difficult. I was always, making the cups of teas and giving the cuddles without cuddling, without being cuddled in return. And I remember, how I had those conversations with him that, I just want to sit on the couch and have a cup of tea with you and just connect again. Whereas, in his mind, everything, resorted and resounded right back to sex. And he couldn't understand why I had no desire or drive to be intimate with him in a consensual way, because, non-consensual sex had been happening for so many years and so constant for such a long time that he just couldn't understand that I have no desire to do those things because of what you're doing to me, and I need you to stop that. And I remember having these conversations with you. I need you to stop. This makes me hate you, and saying what it was. And I'd get the remorse. I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. And eventually that shifted into, I remember having to say, don't bother apologising. Don't cry. Don't talk to me about it. Prove it by not doing it anymore. And that was about the only, agency I had in those moments after something had happened, was to say, don't even bother apologising. Don't cry at me. Just stop doing it. Get help. Change what you're doing and prove it to me with your actions. Yeah, those diary entries just really undermined all of that. That I don't think could change.
No, even though they purport to demonstrate, that he's sorry and that he feels like an asshole, as he says in them, and, but they still definitely are gaslighting, aren't they? They're still all about it being your fault. And
yeah, they're full of manipulation. So they get twisted, twisted right back around to, but you had a part to play in this too. So, which, I'm sorry, but it's kind of like, I'm not a racist, but, I'm sorry, but, completely undermines the I'm sorry. And, that there was honestly nothing genuine in there, and the continuous, way that he blamed my mental health without even understanding that he was the main cause of the deterioration. Seeing that written down was hard.
How would you feel about because as you're talking, I can see sentences that reflect what you're saying, but I don't want to read them in case, would that be triggering? Would you rather I read it in later?
No, you can read it, yep.
So, for example, just as you said that, I read, she had existing baggage before we met. I was a positive experience for her. Early on, I empathised with her as she had depressive episodes where I was not the trigger. The trigger was something else that's been blocked out at that stage, and I would have to calm her down. Many times I spent hours crying as she described situations she had been through. So, he's definitely saying, she's always been crazy.
Yeah, and irrespective of whether or not I was or I wasn't, I did have mental health before I met him. A lot of us do suffer with different forms of, mental health at varying degrees, but, it was nowhere near as bad as what it got during that relationship. And even on the other side of it, I'm not the same person as I was going into that. And there's damage that is irreversible.
That's part of a I know I've done a terrible thing to my wife, but why does she not see that she has a part to play in how things turned out? So that's part of that sorry but equation.
And I spent so much time in that relationship, seeking help for myself, trying to fix myself, trying to get better, in and out of treatment, but then, seeing the pattern of as I became more independent and as I got better, so this is with my eating disorder, with the anorexia, as I got better, that his violence would start to escalate. And I remember the last program I entered, I had to actually be honest with them and say, I need to stop and I need to leave because this is what's going on at home. And the only way for things to de-escalate again is for me to disengage. So,
of course, because the threat of your getting well and getting independent, and is the threat of you leaving him.
Yeah, and I did the things to be independent, and I did. If I wasn't in trouble for, you're too reliant, you need me too much, you're too needy, you need me more than I need you. Toxic things that he would say, to then I'd start to become more independent. I'd start to do things for myself again, and then it was, well, you don't need me. Why do we even stay together? And then his violence would start to escalate. So it was sort of, there was no right way for me to be, and I was constantly trying to just fit in and around those eggshells and constantly trying to appease whatever it is. But it just kept changing and it kept shifting, that there was no appeasing. and
No.
constantly dancing that, and then not wondering, and then him not being able to see how that was then impacting my mental health, and just that blame constantly on the person, where all of this was outside of my control.
And you're being raped constantly. I mean, it's so hard to fathom now, isn't it, from the outside, that you could consider that anything else could be part of the problem when that's happening.
Yeah. And one of those entries where it just said, please believe that I would never do anything to hurt you or other children. And the worst, experience for me was, not eating. I'd gotten so unwell and I was weak and I passed out and on the kitchen floor, and that happened twice, and he violated me on the kitchen floor, and it was phrased as, use this as motivation to eat. If you didn't pass out, I wouldn't do that to you. How is that making, passionate love to the one that you love, which he said in those diary entries? How is that, please believe that I never meant to hurt you? Because that was, and I remember seeing my psychiatrist and just crying to him about it, and him saying, I'm so sorry. I know I wanted you to, I wanted to motivate you to eat, but this isn't the motivation that anybody needs. This is not the motivation I wanted to find for you.
The diaries also mention still knocks, and there's one that says, was it a dream, or is she just unable to respond? What is happening due to the still knocks? So were you aware that he was also drugging you and raping you while you were unconscious at the time, or did you find that out later?
No. Well, the still knocks was something that I was choosing to take myself every now and then. I did not sleep. So the thing is, what was going on in that home, this was every single night. If it wasn't, and it would slowly get worse, and it would escalate and escalate and escalate until it did become, penetration rape. But if it wasn't hands or fingers or being, constantly rubbed on, and it was every single night. I did not sleep. I had just constant insomnia because what's going to happen tonight? What's he going to do? I'm getting woken up because it was just constantly disgusting and degrading and vile. So eventually I would try and take it without him knowing that I'd taken it. So he wouldn't see that I'd actually taken any medication to try and get a good night's sleep. Most nights he would, sort of test the waters to see if I'd wake up, and then I'd usually slap him and hit him, push him away and tell him to fuck off. And then the nights when obviously he'd worked out that I wasn't able to respond was when he would do that. And I knew in the morning what had happened, because, there's certain things that bodies don't do when they're not receptive to sexual advances, and that's painful. It's very painful. And I'd wake up and I'd say to him, how dare you? You've fucking done it again. Yeah.
He convinced himself that he was sort of doing you a favour, didn't he? Because he thought, he says, I feel it is okay, and as she is not awake. But that's what he was saying. Was it a dream? He was thinking, well, she won't even know, so it's probably better this way.
But the thing is, I told him repeatedly that I knew and that it wasn't okay and that it hurt me, and yet he still wrote something like that in his diary, which just didn't make any sense, because I was constantly telling him I knew what had happened. You can't not wake up and know that someone's violated you, and just the feeling of betrayal and disgust and eventually waking up that morning and saying how dare you. And then he'd cry and he'd say all those things. I can't
imagine the feeling of being used in that way.
But it's that, all of those apologies. And like I said, it eventually was just like, don't bother saying sorry. Don't waste your breath. Don't disregard me like that, because I'm not listening to it. And that was, as I said, the only agency I had in those moments was to push back and just say, don't even bother saying sorry.
Who was the first person you told about the diary entries or that you showed?
Well, Nina. Well, my partner Mark, he had sort of, my new partner had looked at them with me a while ago. But ultimately, Nina is the first person that I've opened up and shared that with, because I didn't fully sort of was able to take in, what do I do with these? What do these mean? I find them confronting. And during the Let Us Speak campaign, I've had lots of conversations with her. The trust was built, and after months and months of conversations, I was able to sort of talk to her about some of the bits and pieces that I had here, and to sort of gauge her thoughts on those. But it took that level of trust to be able to open up and say, this is the stuff I've got. What do you think?
Gosh, that's it's a lot to have kept to yourself from the place of being in that court situation where you were so minimised, to have had these diary entries for years. How many years? 4 or 5 years?
No, probably like about 2-3 years. Yeah, 3 years now,
okay.
I think. Yep, 3 years.
So how have you felt since they have been in print and people have read them? And I'm assuming people have spoken to you about them?
Yeah. Seeing everybody else's sort of level of shock, and I think this is something that, other victim survivors do, because it's our story and we know it. I downplay a lot of, I guess, the severity of it all. I downplay what it all means. I downplay how shocking it is in my own mind. And for me to see and hear that reflected from other people, just how shocking and how confronting they are, makes all of that real again, and reminds me that, yes, this wasn't something that was just, dismissive, as the magistrate, the judge had said in those sentencing remarks as well, that, this was disgusting and horrific and abhorrent, and, that I guess it brings the reality of it all to me. And for me, I guess that's a really good thing, because I do downplay it a lot. I do disconnect from it all. And the only way to really unpack those years is to confront it. And sometimes you need other people to help you do that. Yeah.
And if I can jump in here, Michelle, and comment as well on try to explain the kind of courage that it takes for Nicole to share that. She said it was months and months of us talking, but I think it's also important to highlight that, one of the things that I really learned from those conversations with Nicole is the nature of the abuse is obviously that you minimise what's happened to you and you internalise some degree of self-blame or shame or self-loathing around that. But in Nick's case, what had also happened was that at court, the sentencing judge had bought into and then reproduced those same tropes around blaming the woman, minimising what had happened, but also extolling his virtues as a great dad, a great husband. It was really shocking to read the diary entries, the list of crimes themselves, and then the sentencing remarks where the judge had really kind of framed him as a good bloke. And so when Nick and I were talking about, releasing these diaries, it was a huge, obviously it's a vote of trust as a journalist, but it's an even bigger vote of trust in the public, and trusting that they're going to hold your story and carry it with respect and be able to see through that and cut through that those myths and those stereotypes around the good bloke and so on. And I remember, just before we went to print, Nick was so, I hope it's okay for me to share this, Nick, but Nick was so anxious because you never know how this stuff is going to land, right? Like, you never know. Are people going to read the diaries and see him saying, that she's a crazy woman and this and this? And I felt, objectively speaking, no, like I think that
that they are so shocking, and that people will be able to actually see that what he's doing is manipulating the facts and the reality as a form of ongoing gaslighting, and how he's actually sort of, how he's within his own mind, he's twisting things so that he can excuse himself of any culpability and responsibility around his own actions. But you always worry, like you worry that you're putting this stuff out there, and how's it going to land? How are people going to respond? And I just wanted to make that point, because I don't think it's as simple as people might assume.
Yeah.
When a survivor goes
yeah,
forward
absolutely.
And
I was thinking, Nick, as you were talking about,
huge
minimising the crimes, that you felt as though you had minimised the crimes, and I was just thinking, I just don't want you to minimise your achievements. Like, to me, it's a story about you and what you lived through in that relationship between 2005 and 2014, and then getting to court, which in and of itself is just so incredibly difficult. So overcoming everything from anorexia to, everything, all of this as a mum of, small children through this process as well, and then to discover these diary entries, and then to have the courage to publish them, and by the way, going to uni and being an advocate and an activist, to me, that would be the tragedy if you were undermining that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to, take that on board. That's just me. It is hard to see those sorts of traits in yourself, but I think just sort of explaining to people, just how damaging the criminal justice system can be for victims, and that, releasing that gave me more validation than that sentencing, than that sentence that he received. That really validated that what he did was a crime, that what he did was wrong and horrific. Whereas, the 2 years, 6 months, and those sentencing remarks, it was dismissive. And, we look at criminal justice proceedings as being a way to validate victims and to provide them with, sort of that recognition of what they've been through. And it did absolutely the opposite. Whilst I got that conviction, it was not validating. But the fear that releasing that for me, and I think I texted Nina that morning, I said, what if nobody cares?
Yeah, well, a lot of people cared. And also we must make the point that, did you have to go to court to be able to tell your story?
Yes. So, under the Let Us Speak campaign, which Nina can probably speak more to this, and all of that money that was raised under the GoFundMe, was used to support, I think, 12 of us in total to get court orders to be able to speak. So, mine was one of the sort of earlier ones to be put through, but it was such a confronting process, thinking that I have to go back into a court because of somebody else's actions. I have to go back into that. Somebody else has to pay for this, and he didn't have to pay for it. It didn't cost him any money, and it was his actions that I need to now go into that courtroom for.
Why was that, Nina? What was the legislation that was preventing Nick from telling her story at that time?
Yeah, sure. So in February, the Victorian Government made amendments to the Judicial Proceedings Reports Act, and the effect of those amendments were that sexual assault survivors whose offenders had been found guilty, so Nicole is one of those individuals, were then prohibited from speaking out under their own names unless they sought and obtained a court order. So Nick was actually one of the first two women who we started the campaign with in Victoria. And then, she's right, we went and we applied for 12 in total. We've got 11 of the 12 so far. But the process of obtaining those court orders has been incredibly taxing and grueling on the individual survivors. And, there's a couple of things that have happened. In a number of those cases, the offenders have been contacted by the courts and asked whether or not they think the victim survivor should be entitled to use their own name and their own story as a survivor. And in Nick's case, the sentencing judge who had originally made made those good bloke-styled remarks was consulted by the judge making the decision on whether or not she should be allowed to get a court order. And that process in and of itself for Nick, I know, having supported throughout, was extraordinarily confronting to think that not only do you not get to make the decision, but these two blokes sitting around somewhere talking about whether or not you as a woman, as a survivor, should be entitled to tell your own name and your own story. And while we did eventually get the court order, and we're, on behalf of everybody in the campaign, and I think everybody who's donated, we're really, really thrilled and supportive that you've got that. You should never have had to get it. That's the point.
Yeah, our rights should never have been taken away. And I think, the campaign was incredibly difficult because it was hard for people to really understand exactly what had happened and why and how. And then there was reporting early on that, that they're going to jump and fix it and change it straight away. And it felt a lot like, everybody turning their backs. And I waited, and we did wait a while to put out my story. There was a few moments there when I thought, okay, I've got my order now, but you know what? I never want to speak again. I don't want to do this anymore. All of these people that have turned their back on the campaign, on myself as an advocate, on all of us, all of the things that went on during these months, just sort of, I felt a little jaded there for a little while, but it's okay. It's all back again. It's been very hard, and much harder than what it needed to be, and much harder than I think any of us even, the Nina even expected it to be. Like, I didn't even think this would ever have gone public, let alone having to be such an open fight to get the right thing done and the action taken that was needed.
And on that, Michelle, we're so grateful for you and your listeners as well, because we have had a lot of support from you and from your community. That hasn't necessarily been consistent across the mainstream media. It's been kind of interesting to watch how that's unfolded. And it's taken a little while for people to actually accept that, yes, this was a law change made in February. It really did have this effect. And, yes, we really are fighting and having to fight for these court orders. But what's happened in Parliament this week is the government has, obviously conceded that they did do this back in February. It is a real problem and it needs to be fixed. So, and that fix would not have happened, or would not be happening, were it not for Nick and the other 11 survivors in this campaign. But there are also some more broadly. We know the sisters in the Lather case, for example, also obtained court orders. And I think that collective strength of survivors to push for and demand for change, with or without having the support of the mainstream media at all points in time, to be honest. But it's there. It has been them championing it that's triggered that development in law, and, that's their legacy.
I am looking at this list on the story from news.com.au. This is your story, Nick, but down the bottom there's a list, Nina, of people that you've worked with and you've helped them tell their stories and you helped them get their court orders. Ashley Ray Cooper, Phil Nagel, Tracy Morris, Paul Levy. It's literally, I've got shivers just thinking about the idea that victims had to go back to court and had to fight so hard to be able to tell their stories, that this responsibility fell onto the shoulders of victims is just unbelievable. But thank you, Nicole, and thank you so much, Nina. Your work has been extraordinary on this matter. It's amazing, both of
Thanks.
you. How are you feeling, Nick? Are you okay?
It's been a tough week.
Yeah,
it has been a tough week after putting out that article and having my ex-husband contacting my oldest son to abuse him was pretty shocking.
Oh,
and
no.
seeing that language that was used, and knowing, he had treatment whilst in prison. He did programs and he's had behaviour change programs and he's done that, intense corrections after, exiting prison. So probably about 4 years worth of programs to see, the exact same person that I saw before he was, remanded into custody, and realising that I think there's just some men that can never change, realising that this person still thinks that they're a victim, and even using the language around, that he pled guilty just for me, and what a great bloke he is for that. And I tell you what, and this is the interesting thing, when it came down to all the evidence that they had against him, which is rare in in a sexual assault case, is that when there was plea dealing going on, it was all of the charges, or we take you to a trial because we'll convict at a trial. So if he had pled not guilty, I really wouldn't have cared because he'd still be in that prison. I would have, gone to that trial. I would have held my own. It would have been really difficult, but you know what? I would have done it, and he would have got a much longer sentence in the end of the day. So to sit there and at this day and say, but I did that for her. No, you didn't. You did that for a lighter sentence. And, that's why, people plead guilty in these cases and do plea deals, because it gets them a much lighter sentence. And it was said in those sentencing remarks, if he had pled not guilty, he would have got 7.5 years. But because of that discount, he only got 2.5 years, and that's a huge, huge incentive. But who are we ultimately saving here, and how is that again not feeling like justice for victims, because it didn't feel like justice, that sentence.
It's incredibly frustrating for detectives too, because they say, where's our incentive? Here we put together the best brief we can, and the better it is, the more likely they are to plead guilty, and then they get a reduced sentence, Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember, and I understand, their point. And when they came into me straight afterwards, I was in a separate room, watching it all via video link, and they came in and they just said, a result is a result. And they're right. And I had to just take that and just a result is a result, because I guess sometimes, they don't, quite often, more often than not, they don't get a result. But, having to sit there and take that on board, and then have to leave that room and spend, the next few years rebuilding my life, regaining my ability to make decisions, regaining my ability to pay my own bills, to pull myself and my children out of poverty with some sort of dignity, which was very, very hard. There's a lot of horrible people out there. These are the things we lack for victim survivors. These are the things we lack on the outside. And the other side of that process is, the systems and supports needed for somebody to rebuild their life, to rebuild their children, to deal with their trauma, to help carry them, and to, bring them back out of that poverty that they've been left with. That's where we're failing victims. That's where we're failing on the other side of this.
Yep. Again, see, that's what you got to remember. That's amazing. You have done more in your lifetime, Nicole, than most of us could ever think to achieve. And you're still such a young woman. You have much more to do. It's extraordinary. That's the story to me. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Nina, that the nerves prior to dropping the story, because of course I knew it took a lot of courage, but it never occurred to me that the two of you would be worried about how it would be read. To me, I just read it immediately as the way that we're talking about it now. But you're right. Now I understand that there would be nerves attached to it. But no, you mustn't ever think that there's any other way to read it, Nicole. It's a story of you and what a woman you are.
Well, there's that fear of retribution. Yeah, there's a fear of retribution from him as well. I think that seeing those messages this week really, really shocked me. And I've spent the last week with my house completely locked up like a prison again. I've got my roller shutters down, I've got my front door locked, and I'm conscious around what noises, is the dog barking, who's driven past the house, all of those things. I'm hyper aware again, because there was rage in those messages, and that did bring back, am I safe? And I have been, and I have been safe. So I'll give him that benefit of the doubt. He hasn't come around to my house. But it's a risk every time somebody names someone. What are they going to do? How angry are they going to be? And how difficult are they going to make your life after that? And I don't want to live with that fear forever. So I've done it. I've named him. The fear is done. If he's going to do anything, I'll know now. I don't have to sit there contemplating it, thinking about it. Every time I speak publicly, is that going to be the time that pisses him off? It's done. He doesn't have that hold over me anymore.
If there's anything in this podcast that has affected you, please phone 1-800-RESPECT, the National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service, or go to the website 1800respect.com.au. There's also Lifeline on 131114.
Thank you to Nicole Lee and Nina Funnell for joining us for this episode of Australian True Crime. You can contribute to the Fighting Fund to help survivors like Nicole pay their legal fees in these ridiculous situations so they can tell their own stories by donating to the Let Us Speak GoFundMe campaign. There's a link in the show notes to today's episode and also on our Facebook page. Thank you to patrons Erin Here, Jodie Corrigan, Lisa Samuels, Carmel Dugan, Samantha Nixon and Josephine Walsh. And thank you for downloading this episode of Australian True Crime, made in association with the Acast Creator Network. We'll be back in 2022, but every week until then we'll be introducing you to something fresh from another true crime creator. Take care.
Welcome to Acast Recommends. Every week, we pick some of our favourite shows, and this is one we think you're gonna love.
The Daily Oz is a news podcast for young people, by young people.
We were always the friends who got asked to explain the news, and 3 years later, we bring accessible, bite-sized news to over 75,000 Instagram followers each day. Now, we're delivering the news to your headphones. I'm Sam, and I'm 26.
And I'm Zara, I'm 24, and we're here to make sure you're informed before you finish your morning coffee. We speak your language and we know what matters to you.
The experience of getting your head around the news should be as easy as Facebook and Netflix. We're here to provide that. Join us every weekday wherever you get your podcasts and follow us on Instagram at The Daily Oz.
Subscribe to this show and hundreds more now via Acast or wherever you get your podcasts.